talking about? Who loves me?
The guy in here, man. And the guy in here. The Bible.
This is the bibble.
You question the words of the mighty Jimmy!
And we're back for another one. We're tackling more biblical references in Fire Emblem today, this time for the 3 titles released on the Game Boy Advance. And like I said before, I doubt there's any real significance to these characters having biblical names, but it's still fun to point them out. So with that, let's get right to it. We start with Noah from the Binding Blade. Noah, of course, is most known for the story of Noah's Ark, in which God sends a great flood to cover the earth out of lament for the sins of humanity. He spares only the faithful Noah and tells him to build an ark to house himself, his family, and 2 of every animal so that they can survive the flood. He does, and they remain on the ark for 40 days and 40 nights. Once the waters receded and the inhabitants of the ark came out, God sent a rainbow to adorn the sky as a sign of his promise to not flood the world again. Next, we have Saul, and actually there are 2 Sauls in the Bible. The first Saul was the first king of Israel, though his story was a tragic one. He led Israel to many military victories, but was ultimately undone by his ego and his jealousy of David, who eventually succeeded him as king. Saul died by falling upon his sword after his final military defeat at the hands of the Philistines. The second Saul is Saul of Tarsus, better known to most as the Apostle Paul. Originally a Pharisee and one of the most aggressive opponents of the Christian movement, Saul experienced a sudden conversion upon meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, where he had plans to persecute the faithful. After his conversion, he quickly became the faith's greatest spokesperson, and spent most of the rest of his life spreading the gospel throughout the Roman Empire and writing a substantial chunk of what would become the New Testament. Next, we have Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham. He was one of the central figures in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which God sends 2 angels to Lot's home to warn him about the upcoming destruction of the 2 cities. He flees the following morning with his wife and daughters, but his wife doesn't make it due to her ignoring the warning from the angels to not look back at the burning cities, causing her to turn into a pillar of salt. We also have Marcus, which is the Roman Latin name for Mark, who is said to have written the Gospel of Mark. Despite being placed second in the order of the 4 Gospels, most scholars agree that it was the first of the 4 to be written down, and was the source from which the Gospels of Matthew and Luke copied much of their content. Things get a little complicated for Sophia, because as far as I know, the name Sophia is never directly mentioned in the Bible. However, given that Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and wisdom is personified in the Bible with feminine language, most notably in the book of Proverbs, some Christians over the last 2,000 years have interpreted that to mean that Sophia is its own female spiritual entity, perhaps a part of God or perhaps something distinct from him. I don't exactly know what all to say here since I'm neither a pastor nor a theologian nor a scholar, but I do recommend diving down the rabbit hole on this topic if you ever get the chance. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Moving on to the Blazing Sword, Marcus returns and we have another Paul as well. We also have Mark. Gee, maybe I should have waited till I got to an actual Mark before talking about Mark. Oops. And we have the characters Sarah and Jake too, but I previously covered those, so I won't recap them here. We do have plenty of new characters though, starting with Dorcas, who receives a brief appearance in the Book of Acts. Dorcas, aka Tabitha, was a woman who was an early follower of Jesus and who served the community by making clothes. She suffered an untimely death due to illness but was resurrected upon being visited and prayed for by the disciple Peter. This event led to many in the surrounding area to convert to the faith. We also have Lucius, which is a reference to Lucius of Cyrene, and even more so than Dorcas, this is a blink and you'll miss it sort of reference. He receives only 2 passing mentions in the New Testament, one in Acts and one in Romans, and no one is even certain if they refer to the same Lucius. Regardless, Lucius, whether singular or plural, appears to have been an early figure in the church associated with the Apostle Paul. Priscilla receives more attention in the New Testament, always mentioned with her husband Aquila. Together they worked closely with and traveled with the Apostle Paul at various points throughout his ministry, and are credited with helping Apollos, another man who worked with Paul, gain a better understanding of the gospel. Pivoting back to the Old Testament briefly, Rebekah is a reference to Rebekah, the wife of Isaac in the book of Genesis. She was found from afar by one of Abraham's servants to be Isaac's wife, and the modern wedding tradition of the bride wearing a veil is said to have come from Rebekah's first meeting with Isaac. We also have Matthew, the writer of the book of Matthew, and one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Also known as Levi, he was a tax collector prior to being a disciple, collecting tax revenue for the Romans. Not much is known about him for certain, but presumably, like other tax collectors of his time, he would lie about how much people owed and pocket the difference. Matthew left his position one day on the job when Jesus asked Matthew to follow him, and the rest, I guess, is history. And now that we've covered Matthew and Mark, and since I covered Luke in my last references video, let's round out the 4 gospel writers by discussing John, or in this case, Jan. I suppose this could apply to John from FE6 as well. John, of course, was one of the disciples of Jesus, and not just that, he, his brother James, and Peter were the 3 disciples closest to Jesus. In fact, it was John that Jesus asked to take care of his mother Mary as his dying wish upon the cross. John is also credited with writing 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which is separate from the Gospel of John that he is said to have written, I know it's confusing, as well as the book of Revelation, the true most metal book of the Bible. Moving on to the sacred stones, we have a reference in the form of one of the 2 main lords of the game, Ephraim. Ephraim was one of the sons of Joseph, and his namesake was carried by one of the 12 tribes of Israel, but aside from that, the Bible surprisingly doesn't say that much about him. We do know about some of his descendants though, the most notable of which being Joshua. Joshua was an assistant to Moses, playing a role in the Exodus, and he also accompanied Moses to the top of Mount Sinai when Moses received the 10 Commandments. Joshua eventually succeeded Moses as the leader of the Israelites, and finished the job of bringing the Israelites into the Promised Land. The Sacred Stones also has Pablo, which of course is an alternate name for Paul, and lastly, we have myrrh. Myrrh wasn't a person in the Bible, but it was one of the 3 gifts the Magi gave to the baby Jesus sometime after his birth, along with gold and frankincense. And thus, unless I missed anything, that wraps up the GBA era of biblical references in Fire Emblem. Stick around for more references in the future, or for whatever else I have on the docket. Stay tuned and I'll see you soon.